All right, thank you all for coming tonight. It's nice to have such a nice turnout, especially as Anna and I were saying with the holiday and the nice weather and the Guardians game. I'm so glad that people could make it out. So thank you for being here. I'll just tell you a little bit about who I am and what I do. I am a licensed clinical psychologist. I work with parents of kids of all ages and then kids kind of across the age span. So from about school age up through young adulthood. I have a private practice on the other side of town, but I also do virtual parent consult work. And I consult for Laurel School in Shaker Heights. So there I consult all the way across the age span from early childhood. Our youngest kiddos are about 18 months, all the way up to our great big seniors. And then I'm a co-director of our in-house research center there, Laurel School Center for Research on Girls. So I wear a lot of different hats professionally. Personally, I'm a mom to 3 kids, and this is the first year that I have kids at every division, elementary school, middle school, high school. So aside from being like a part-time chauffeur in my spare time, just kind of like driving everyone everywhere, I feel like I'm getting a taste of all of the executive functioning challenges and opportunities for growth that come at each of these kind of divisions of development. So coming to it from that perspective as well. So the goal of tonight is to start with an overview of executive functions. It's kind of a buzzy word, a buzzy topic, so we'll kind of drill down and get some good definitions of that. We'll dive into what some of the specific skills are, and then we will think about some of the kind of related and secondary skills. Then we'll get into the meat of what we'll talk about today is, now that we know what they are, how do we support our kids and how do we set fair expectations for where they are and where we want them to be headed or where we think that trajectory is going. I always think these presentations are most helpful when they are interactive. So as we're going along, if there are things that you are thinking of, examples or questions or challenges, or my very favorite, things that you feel like, oh, we've hacked this one and we've got a good solution that works for our family and we want to share it. Those are always like little nuggets of gold. Jot it down, make a note in your phone so that when we get to the Q&A, we have a lot of rich data to work with. I put some handouts throughout. There's also a QR code on the handout. So if there's not enough, or if you don't see one in front of you, you can always just scan that. It links to my website and information on my virtual executive functioning course, which is available for parents. It's really designed for kids school age, really through like early high school, I would say, starting in about first grade up through early high school, really focuses on executive functions, takes what we talk about here today and makes it goes much more in depth and a lot of applicable kind of daily strategies. Okay, so we will dive in. So we're going to start with thinking about what executive functions are. And before we get to definitions, I want us to think for a moment about all the steps that got you to this point at 6:30 tonight, right? So you have children, you had to navigate getting yourself up, making sure your children were up, making sure everyone was ready for the school day, bringing the things that they needed. Perhaps you had to pack yourself up for work and get yourself there. You might have had to employ some skills like working memory and remembering the address of where you were coming for this tonight, or remembering the time that your child had to be picked up and dropped off at the next thing. You might have had to employ some flexibility if, like me, you forgot that your child did not actually have school today because it was a holiday and conferences. And so then you were doing some last minute scrambling. Thankfully, it was a couple days ago I realized that. But some last minute scrambling around childcare and figuring that piece out. Maybe you had to use some impulse control. If you're also like me, you probably had to pull yourself back from checking your email or picking up your phone more times than you wanted to keep yourself focused on your work or your tasks at hand. All of us have used our executive functioning skills about 1 billion times by the time we've reached this point in the day. And it's not done yet, right? You're going to leave here. You probably have kids to get to bed and homework to supervise and all of those sorts of things. So executive functioning skills, one of the important things to remember about them is they are involved in most aspects of daily life. We sometimes think of these as school skills, and they certainly do show up in almost every part of the school day. But we also use them at home. We use them in our relationships. Our kids use them in their relationships with their teammates, with their classmates, with their friends, with their siblings, with you, their parents, their caregivers. You use them all day long to manage all the parts of your day. If it's at work, if it's at home, probably both. These are high-level cognitive skills. These are advanced cognitive skills. They are mostly orchestrated by the prefrontal cortex of the brain, which is the last part of the brain to develop. So if we think about this part up here near the front, this part of the brain is not fully developed until we are in our mid-20s. And then it feels like we've got like a good peak period of like 7 or 8 years, and then it all starts to kind of trickle downhill again. But if we think about those executive functioning skills and we put that in the sphere of development, none of our kids are graduating high school with that part of their brain fully cooked. And that's a helpful reminder for me as a parent when I'm in that stage of like, you really forgot your water bottle again, right? Like remembering that there is a very long runway of development for those executive functioning skills. And many of them are not really coming online or really maturing until middle to late adolescence and even into young adulthood. Our executive functioning skills assist us in meeting challenges, accomplishing goals, getting through our to-do tasks, even things like our daily routines. And when we talk about how do we support executive functioning development, routines are a big piece of this. But if we're doing routines that are part of our daily life or we're approaching a new situation, those are going to tap into different aspects of our executive functioning skills. We talked about how these develop into adulthood. And we talked about how they do impact most areas of daily life. So again, we're going to talk about school, but we're going to zoom it out as well too and think about all the places that these show up. Okay, we're going to do a little myth buster. Here are some of the things that we sometimes think might be true about executive functions. And this is not specific to executive functions, by the way. If you're a parent, if you work with kids, you know that development does not occur in this smooth, linear, like beautiful curved kind of trajectory, right? It is generally advancing. It is generally moving forward. We know what it looks like as they get older and their brain gets a little more solid, but it is very much stop-start. It can feel very much like 2 steps forward, 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 steps back, right? And especially when we're talking about executive functions, there can often be periods of time, and one of these is early adolescence, so like 11, 12 years old, where it sometimes feels like my kid feels like they're backsliding with this. Part of the reason for that is if we think about that middle school age range, what happens when we're making that transition to middle school out of elementary school? We're starting puberty, there's a lot going on, hormones, brain development, everything is involved. Everything feels a little less stable than it did even like 18 months before. We're timing that right up with middle school, which for most kids looks like all of a sudden I'm managing lots of different things, lots of classes, different teacher personalities, different systems for turning in homework and even knowing where to find my homework, so that as the executive functioning demands are stepping up, development is getting a little rockier. So it's not at all unusual to have a kid who looked pretty solid in this space when they were in 4th grade, really starting to struggle midway through like 6th grade. Anna and I were talking before the program that this is pretty well timed because we are through the honeymoon period of this new school year, right? So you may be experiencing some of the bumps that start to occur in mid-fall. It's about conference time, right? So some of these things, the executive functioning cracks may be starting to show. Okay, this is one of my favorite myths to bust about executive functioning. We sometimes think about like a 12-year-old. Now, if I ask you to picture a 12-year-old in your mind, everyone's version of that is going to look a little bit different. One of my colleagues put this in a way that I will never forget. If you gather a room of 6th graders, it looks a little bit like a Star Wars bar, right? There's like mutants and they're like different sizes, and some of them are really loud and like taking up in a lot of space and like knocking into people, and some are like timid, and they look all different ways. And if you go walk through the halls of a middle school, that's a little bit what you're going to see. You're going to see kids who physically resemble more like 4th graders, and you're going to see kids who physically look more like full-grown adults, right? And everything in between. The same is true for executive functioning skills. Just as we know that physical growth happens at different phases and often happens in spurts, like we expect physical growth spurts, and we prepare for them by dumping out $200 more at Old Navy because they outgrew everything they owned. We don't always remember that executive functioning works that same way. So a room of 12-year-olds, you are going to see kids who are on it, who have the planner, who know what they have to do, who have studied for the test, who are bringing the stuff home, who are reminding their siblings to bring their stuff home. And then you're going to have kids who are barely keeping it together when it comes to executive functioning. There's a very wide range of typical, right? And so one of the things that we'll talk about nearer the end today is what do we do when we feel like we're veering outside of the typical challenges with executive functioning? We know that kids are going to struggle with executive functioning at all points in development, but we can hit points where it feels like this feels like it's harder than it should be for all of us. I say all of us because if your child is struggling with executive functions, you're probably getting pulled into it as well. Just like kids' executive functioning skills develop differently amongst kids, executive functioning skills within a child develop at different paces. So we're going to talk about what some of these specific skills are, but just for example, if you think about something like impulse control, right? And then you think about something like flexibility. These are two core executive functions. These do not always develop at the same pace, at the same rate for kids. You can have kids who have very strong impulse control, but can be pretty rigid, right? So if we think about these different areas of executive functioning, this is not a unitary construct. This is a broad umbrella with a lot of skills that fall underneath it, and they can progress at different rates of development. Okay, this last one is a good reminder for all of the adults that our executive functioning skills are not like a light switch being flipped on. Once we arrive at 24 and they're there, they're ready to serve us, they're never going to fail us. We know that's not true, right? So if you think about any time where your executive functioning skills have let you down, whether it's, completely forgot that I had that meeting or needed to send that email, or I'm at the grocery store and I don't have my list and I couldn't even tell you what we have and what we don't have or what I was planning on making for dinner. Executive functioning skills are not always reliable. And we'll talk a little bit about some of the things that can get in the way, but it's important to know that when you're looking at a kid of any age and you feel like, okay, we've made good progress with the working memory part and the routines, or we're making such good progress with the impulse control, we don't arrive at a place of executive functioning completion. These are ever-growing and evolving skills, especially over the course of childhood. So we will expect to see times where they kind of flicker a little bit more than just turning on and staying there. Okay, we're going to start with thinking about some of these core executive functions. When we think about the domain of executive functioning, this has been well studied by neuropsychologists and academic researchers for decades. I feel like it kind of got the buzzy lift to it maybe about 10-ish years ago when it started being used more in popular media and people were talking about it in schools. But we know actually that these skills have been studied for a very long time, and there's different models of executive functions and what they look like, but one that has consistently sort of risen to the top in terms of repeatable evidence of 3 distinct skills is this one. And when we think about these 3 core executive functions, it does not mean that every area of executive functioning is covered by these 3. And in fact, we'll spend a little bit of time on some of the executive functioning adjacent skills. But a lot of what we talk about when we're talking about executive functioning falls into one of these 3 buckets: working memory, inhibitory control, and cognitive flexibility. And we're going to dive into each of these, but for right now, know that these are sort of the basic executive functioning skills. We'll start with working memory. Working memory, we can think of this like a mental Post-it note, right? This is the thing. Before we could just share contacts on our phone, if somebody gave you their phone number, you were repeating it over and over in your head until you could jot it down somewhere, right? This is the thing that if you have to remember, I need to go upstairs, and when I go up there, I got to grab my socks, but also I think I left my laptop up there and I need to check to make sure my kid's brushing their teeth. That list that lives in your brain, that's working memory that is making that happen. Working memory has a ceiling. It is not untapped potential forever and ever. For most grown adults, our limit for what we can hold on to, actually, does anyone want to guess? Anyone want to take a minute or a guess of like how many bits of information we can hold on to in working memory? Yeah, 7. And this is why phone numbers used to be 7 digits, or they are still 7 digits. We just don't have to remember them anymore. Yes, so 7 bits of information. And we're not talking about like 7 complex tasks. We're literally talking about 7 bits of information. So if we think about that as a full-grown adult brain potential for working memory, then we bring that down to a 7 or 8-year-old. And let's say a 7 or 8-year-old maybe with ADHD. Or let's say an 11-year-old who's really anxious about the test and the class that they're walking into. And then we think about a slew of directions that are being tossed out at them, or a big list of things that they are trying to remember or expected to remember. It's kind of a recipe for disaster. So our working memory has a limit, and that doesn't mean that we can't remember more, but we can only hold on to that amount for a short period of time. Working memory is a form of short-term memory. So we're taking information in, we're holding on to it, and then we're doing something with it in a relatively short period of time. This is different than the kind of memory we employ if we are like studying for a test, and then we go in to take the test and we have to retrieve the information. Working memory can be involved with that, but working memory itself is a more in-the-moment kind of skill. When we think about academically how working memory shows up, it is everywhere all day long. So following directions, this is like the working memory at its core. Giving directions, holding on to multi-step directions is working memory. If you are decoding a long word, right? If you're sounding out or trying to decode the word rhinoceros, your working memory is working hard, if that's a novel word to you, because you are having to decode this part, hold on to it, put it together with the next sound, put those together with the last part. Working memory is involved there. When we think about reading comprehension, if we're reading a passage or a paragraph, and then we have to answer questions about it right away, or talk about it, or write a sentence about it, our working memory is used to hold on to the details. And it's not just reading. If you think about math, right? Multi-step math problems. If any of your children are starting to get into like double-digit addition or subtraction, multiplication or long division, there is a whole lot of working memory involved in doing that step-by-step process. Science, if you are going through the steps of a lab or solving an equation, you're having to hold on to that information and use it in real time. So working memory shows up academically all throughout the day across subjects. When we think about how we support working memory, notice that I use the word support here. I don't use the word grow. I don't use the word enhance or like amplify. There are a lot of programs and games and things like that that are marketed toward boosting or skyrocketing, depending on the marketing, working memory. None of those have shown in an evidence-based way to really significantly increase working memory over time. You might see for some of those programs, whether it's like a game or an app or something like that, a short-term and like pretty short-term boost in working memory. But what we know, if we're looking for real life, sustainable, supporting working memory as it grows, is that we have to scaffold opportunities for kids to practice using their working memory. So part of that is giving good directions. So if you think about the last time you gave a multi-step direction to your child, and I am so guilty of this, right? As I was like running out the door today, I was saying to my daughter, like, bring your plate down, don't forget your water bottle, you're getting picked up at 4, and oh, don't forget to stop at the desk at the dance studio and ask if they have your shirt. Like, come on, she was not gonna remember that. It was more like me just spouting it out. That's not good directions, right? Maybe if my daughter was old enough I could know she was already thinking about those things, or she's really solid with 4 steps as I'm like running out the door, but most kids are not gonna be there. Good directions, and especially if we start pretty young, start with one clear step. And so if this is, you're in the room where your child is playing and it's time to come to dinner or it's time to walk out the door for school, pick up your toys sounds like one clear direction. But if your room where your kids play is anything like the room where my kids play, there are all kinds of toys in all of the places, right? So pick up your toys could actually be like a half-day affair if that's really what I wanted them to do. Probably what we want is put these magnet tiles back in the basket on the shelf, right? Or pick up the Legos off the floor. We don't want the dog to eat them. So giving good direction starts with one clear step that is explicit, and so that a child knows I've accomplished the direction, I've completed that step. Eventually, kids can move on to multiple steps. But even then, we are mindful of not overloading a lot of information at that front end. For many kids, it works well to get 1 or 2 steps, and once they've completed those, to then give the next step or the next 2 steps after that. Now, real life, that sometimes does not happen, right? Sometimes we just need to say it and get it done, and we just need to repeat ourselves, and that's okay. But if we're thinking about specifically building the skill of working memory, we're starting small and scaffolding those instructions. Visual supports, we always think about this for very young kids, but I actually like visual supports for slightly older kids too. In young kids, visual supports can look like things like a bedtime routine or a morning routine that you have written out or drawn out together. Young kids cannot read. So if we are putting the word like brush your teeth and they're 2.5, well, it's not so helpful, right? So we are employing pictures. We are putting things that make it interactive. At really any age, kids can start to be a little bit involved with that. So you can have your 5-year-old or your 6-year-old sit with you and help you name the steps of what the bedtime routine looks like. And then you can have them kind of draw some rudimentary pictures and you can write the word next to it. You can get fancy with it, right? Like there's all kinds of fancy ones. If you look at Pinterest or like any of these companies that you can order for them, I can tell you I have never once in the course of my kid's life used a fancy one. Ours are like the jankiest looking like piece of notebook paper that we end up writing on, or that kids end up kind of putting some stickers on, but they have some ownership over it. So it feels like something that they are invested in and they want to participate in. The furthest we've ever gotten, I do recommend this, is either laminating it or doing the like putting the tape, you know, that like clear tape that's like so thick over both sides so that it doesn't get ripped or torn or soaking wet in the bathroom night 1. Using those visual supports is really helpful. As kids get a little bit older, they may still need those visual supports. So for a kid who's in like 4th or 5th grade, they may still need a checklist that helps them remember after school, I get a snack, I have some time to play basketball, then I do my homework, right? Whatever that looks like, knowing what that predictable path will be helps working memory because they're not having to hold on to the set of directions, and it also routinizes the whole experience. One part of the magic of routines is that it allows us to offload some of the work of working memory. So kids are juggling a lot, right? Especially if homework is hard or they're coming in hot and tired at the end of the day. If we know that things are made to be routine, we don't have to put a lot of energy into and what comes next and what's after that. And you, as a parent, don't have to put a lot of energy into negotiating, right? No, we don't watch TV before homework, but do we maybe just this one time watch TV before, like we go back to the list, right? Like, oh, look, here's TV time if homework gets finished. It's right here on the list. So of course, it's not gonna shut down every negotiation, but it does make it a little bit more predictable of like, we can look at the list and see what comes next. Okay, our next core working memory skill is inhibitory control. Inhibitory control goes by a lot of different names. Self-control, impulse control. What we're talking about here is really managing impulses, resisting impulses that are not going to serve us in the goal we're trying to accomplish in the moment. The impulses might really serve the goal of having fun, right? That's usually, or it's interesting, or I'm curious about it. It's appealing, feels good, looks good, tastes good, but it may not serve the goal that we're working toward in that moment. So if the goal is, I'm doing my homework, resisting the impulse might be, I'm not stopping to pick up my phone, or I'm not stopping to look at the TV, or I'm not stopping to get up and go play with the dog every 2 minutes, right? So if we're thinking about what is the goal in this situation and what are the impulses that are likely going to be present. Impulses also can create some of those riskier behaviors for kids. So if you think about very young children, right, we're teaching them to manage impulses when we're talking about like that the stove is hot and here's why we don't touch the stove. There's a process that's actually really cool developmentally of how kids learn the rules of some of these more dangerous impulses that could actually hurt them. If we are saying it with them, we can see kids start to say it for themselves. So if you spent much time like the 3-year-old or something like that, when you're taking a walk, they might see their ball roll into the street and they might say, no street, right? And they've heard that many, many, many times. And them being able to verbalize it, even sometimes like as they're running toward the street, saying like, no street, like running into the street. This is their attempt at building impulse control. Eventually, they typically do not have to keep saying it out loud, and it kind of goes underground. But it's created those pathways that help them to remember to manage the impulses. A lot of these are happening time and time again. And I think about this as like a wheelbarrow continuing to carve out a path, so that eventually what we're hoping for is that path is pretty established. We're not trying to like carve out a new path every time. We kind of settle into the path and we let our wheelbarrow move forward. So whether it's knowing what is safe to do in the kitchen, or knowing how it's safe to play in the yard, or knowing what I need to do when I'm doing my homework, right? That the TV is not on and I'm not sitting here right next to my toys because that's too appealing while I'm trying to do the work. Again, routines can come into play here and be helpful. So the ways that we think about building this important skill, I will say, I think this one is the hardest to build outside of the moment, because it's a very different story to be practicing impulse control when everybody's pretty level-headed and calm than when someone is like supercharged with emotion or very tired at the end of the day, right? So impulse control, it does benefit from practice, but part of the work involves how we manage it in the moment. Things like practicing a pause, so actually articulating for kids. And I talk about like a giant remote that we picture, right? That there's like a pause button or a slow-mo button. I don't know if many kids know about a slow-mo button anymore, because like that's not so much a thing. But a pause button, they know, right? So if we think about like that giant remote in your brain, you're actually picturing yourself pressing pause. And I need to pause. And in that moment, what am I doing? Taking a breath, regulating my body, and I'm thinking about what am I doing, right? What do I need to be doing? What am I doing? You might even say like, is this safe? Is this what I want to be doing? Is this getting in the way? But it's not that long of a pause. It's actually kind of just long enough to take a breath and reset and then move forward. It is not always effective, but we can articulate it, we can practice it with kids in the moment, and we can model it for them. So practicing in the moment might be like, you're sitting down to dinner and there's a plate of cookies on the table and the cookies are for dessert and they're reaching for the cookies and you're saying, oh, hold on, we're going to press our pause button and take a breath. And then whatever you need to do next. Maybe at your house, dinner and dessert happen at the same time. Maybe dessert happens after dinner, but it's just practicing that pause. So they're noticing, oh, I am pausing. I am using my impulse control here. You can model it for them as well when you're about to act, right? And then you can say, oh, hold on, I need to take a pause and think about what I want to do next. We can give nonverbal reminders. So this is especially helpful if your child has like an IEP or a 504 for something related to ADHD and they are constantly hearing their name in the classroom, right? Like, stop talking, are you focusing? But always like preceded by their name. And you know which kids, they're hearing their names often because they will say things like, I'm always getting in trouble, or she's always saying my name. And it's not in a positive way when this is happening because of impulse control. One accommodation that we can think about for kids is establishing some sort of nonverbal cue between teacher and student, that when I'm doing this and when I'm catching your attention, I'm not saying your name, but we've agreed that when you see me kind of like, hey, tug on my ear, or I put my hand on your desk, that we know, oh, right, I need to kind of reset. This could be hard for a 6-year-old, but a little bit more manageable for like a 10 or 11-year-old, which is when they may feel more of that kind of pressure of hearing their name all the time anyway. We can also think about doing things with younger kids to build impulse control through fun and games. So silly things like freeze dance, Simon Says, Mother May I, these are all building impulse control, right? This kind of like stop, start. For older kids, even slightly older kids will still get into like freeze dance or things like that sometimes. But doing things like that allow us to build impulse control. Some of the games that I like with older kids that employ this, do you guys know the game Slapsy? Yeah, it's so fun. But it's this game where like, you have picture cards and then you might have a picture of like a donut and a piano, and the card might be say like something you eat. So you slap your donut, right? And then you get to get rid of your card. But there's a penalty in Slapsy. If you slap your card and it doesn't fit the category, you have to take a new card. So we're building that skill of impulse control, like pause, let me see what I got. Oh, good, and then I can slap it. And that game is actually really fun. I mean, like we play that. I play that with my teenagers at my house. So there are games even for older kids that build that impulse control, inhibitory control. One of the big ways that we address impulse control is by modeling and practicing repair. So often impulse control can result in hurting somebody else, either physically hurting them, right? Like I snatched that from you or I hit you. Like that will happen between siblings or between children, or hurting somebody's feelings, saying something unkind, calling a name. And these are heat of the moment. They are not, for the vast majority of kids, they are not malintended. They are just slips of impulse control. And so we can normalize for kids like our impulse control doesn't always work that well for us. Sometimes it's hard to take the pause. And when that happens, good news. We have this strategy of repair. And what does repair look like? It might involve saying, I'm sorry, and being specific about it. It might involve helping to fix the situation. So if I got mad at you and I pushed over your magnetile tower, it might involve asking you, do you want some help to rebuild it? Or do you want some space, right? And internally, it involves thinking about how am I going to handle that next time? How am I going to handle it when she's got all the cool like blue magnetiles and I only have these boring red ones over here and I really want those. So it's thinking through how we're going to manage this next time. Repair is not the same as just saying, I'm sorry, right? That might be one step of the process, but repair is a much bigger process that happens within families, within classrooms, within teams, within communities. And if we look around at our world, we can see that adults can probably do a much better job of engaging in repair if this is something that we value for our kids as well. So as adults, we can take on the job of modeling repair, pointing out when people are repairing well, and helping kids to start to repair situations that they are involved in. Okay, our last core executive function is cognitive flexibility. Cognitive flexibility involves shifting. It involves shifting ideas, pivoting, making transitions. So stopping your show and coming to dinner, or finding something else to use for your project because it's due tomorrow and you don't have poster board, right? All of these are involved in cognitive flexibility. If we're thinking about strategies to help this, we can balance it between, and we're going to talk about this a little bit more in a moment, what we do beforehand and what we do in the moment. So for example, let's say your child has a hard time transitioning from watching TV to coming to dinner, right? So the beforehand work might be, we're setting the expectation. We're saying we're going to watch one show, or we're watching for this amount of time. And then we are probably helping to scaffold the transition by coming with like knowing, okay, the song is on, it's like the end of the show, or maybe even a couple minutes before, I'm coming, I'm near you, I'm going to help with this transition. And then we're saying, oh, this is the end of the show, we're turning it off after this. And then we are turning it off and moving on to the next thing with some confident momentum. So that is what a transition looks like and how we have to employ this cognitive flexibility to switch from one task to another. Kids with ADHD, which is an area that is highly associated with executive functioning challenges, can also get very hyper-focused on things. So this flexibility and shifting and transitions can be a very challenging part of executive functioning for kids in that domain. It also can be very hard for kids who struggle with anxiety, people who struggle with anxiety. Lots of forms of anxiety involve cognitive rigidity. I have to do things a certain way. I know I'm going to do it this way. It only works if I do it this way. I only feel not nervous if I'm doing it this way. So having to shift, having to adjust involves this skill of cognitive flexibility. Again, we can model flexibility. Anytime we're doing something like, oof, okay, I was gonna make chili for dinner and I do not have the seasoning that I need. So let me think about what I can use instead, right? Like that is modeling flexibility. Saying, oh shoot, okay, I thought this practice started at 5, it actually starts at 4:45. Okay, so I'm gonna think about how am I gonna get out the door a little bit quicker, and is there a better route I can take this time of day to get there? So articulating some of that out loud for our kids helps them to be able to think about how they use flexibility in their own lives. For kids who struggle with anxiety, for kids who have ADHD, for whom flexibility is very hard, validating the difficulty with that goes a long way. We're not asking them not to be flexible. That actually is doing kids a disservice because life requires flexibility. But we're saying things like, I know it's hard. You planned on using poster board for this. You're worried about how it's going to turn out. That stinks. Okay. How do you want to handle this? What do you think we can do? It's hard as a parent to channel that in a moment. I know there's lots of times where I've totally missed the mark on that. But if we're going in with the intent of first I'm validating, holding a little bit of space for the emotion, and then we can shift into problem-solving mode, it almost always goes so much smoother. If we try to zoom into problem-solving mode too quickly, we're going to get stuck. We won't spend too much time on these related skills, although I'm happy to answer questions about them when we get to the Q&A part, but know that all of these are sort of executive functioning adjacent. So things like initiation, putting pen to paper, actually getting started. The opposite of this, procrastination, which is hugely involved in executive functioning. Organization and planning, knowing what's to come, coming up with a plan, being able to execute it or stick with it as best you can. Self-monitoring, which is noticing your own behavior, noticing that effect that your behavior has on other people, noticing your pace of work, looking at your work and noticing errors in your work. All of that falls under the umbrella of self-monitoring. And then the big one that underlines all of these is emotion regulation. So all of these skills that we are talking about can feel inaccessible if we are really having a hard time managing our feelings. So a lot of work around executive functioning might be existing alongside work to learn how to identify emotions, how you know how you're feeling by what your body is telling you, and strategies that help you cope with those intense feelings. Okay, when I work with families around executive functioning, one way that we think about this is this model of I call it the 3 Ps. And we think about it as this cycle of what we do in the preparation stage, what we do in the present, and what we do in the post. The preparation stage is all these foundational skills that support good executive functioning. So you can probably guess the number 1 on the list is sleep. Sleep is the closest thing we have to magic when it comes to executive functioning, when it comes to focus, mood, anxiety, behavior, learning, you name it, sleep helps, or it gets in the way if we're not getting enough of it. So those good habits, we start with sleep. We start with what time do we have to wake up in the morning? How much sleep does your body need at this phase of development? Then we go backwards and everything else happens from there. Especially in families with young children. And even I would say as we're approaching middle school age, I think about bedtime as starting the minute dinner is done. And of course, that doesn't mean that you're going to bed 5 minutes after dinner, but it just means that we have now shifted into the bedtime phase of the day. So everything else that's happening from this point forward is on the long runway of bedtime. And we're thinking about how much time do we have to play? When do the screens need to go off? When does the bedtime routine start, which is those few steps that lead up to bedtime? What is the separation at bedtime looking like? And if you're finding that sleep is a place where there's a lot of tension or a lot of friction, really thinking about what are the steps of that and thinking about it proactively in the preparation stage can help to smooth some of it out. What we're doing in the present, so this is when the cracks are really showing in this executive functioning meltdown, right? Maybe it's we completely forgot the thing that we needed, or we're running late, or we're really having a hard time remembering the information or studying for the test or whatever it is. One thing that we are not going to be doing is a whole lot of talking in this phase because emotions are often running high, yours and your kid, and it's a little bit like trying to talk at a tornado, right? It's not effective. You're just wasting your breath and your voice. So we're thinking about, how am I providing support in this moment? This is not the I'm teaching you a new skill moment. This is the we're riding this out together for the next 12 minutes until we're kind of through this storm. So you may be doing your own work of breathing, of whatever helps you regulate, so that your child can pick up on some of that energy. You may even say, hold on, I need a moment, and take 2 minutes in the bathroom, and then come back with some intention to like, all right, I'm the one with the fully developed prefrontal cortex. Here we go. Like, we're going to get through this phase together. You might be doing a little bit of scaffolding. So if a kid is getting really stuck on something, this is not the hill we want to die on of like, you're going to complete this task. It's more about what parts can you complete and what can I help you complete so that you can move through this and on to the next part of your day. It could be cleaning up toys. It could be studying for a test. It could be managing your bedtime routine and getting ready for the next day. Then we do the post. And this is at first a pretty parent, caregiver heavy part of the equation. You're doing some of the mental lifting here of like, whoa, what happened there? How did we get to that place where it was 10:30 and there was still an hour of homework? Or like, how did we all forget that there was, an extra practice this night and that kept happening? So we're doing a little bit of problem solving, a little bit of detective work. And then we can come to our child depending on their age. Now, if a child is like 8 years old or so, they can start to engage in this with you. Obviously, that's going to look very different than if they're 15, but there's some problem solving that we can do together. We can say something like, "Phew, last night did not feel good. I know it didn't feel good for you. It felt really stressful for me." Again, leave a little space. Then think about like, okay, so we know we have another science test, or you have another science test coming up in a few days. What do you think? Like, what can we try differently? How can we make that move a little bit better? Anything you think could help. And truly going in with that spirit of collaboration. You may have 10 great ideas, and your child's idea may sound not like it's not going to work, but it's worth it to think about what can we pull from what you think might help, and how can we employ some of these strategies. Okay, I want to say a little bit about partnering with schools to support executive functioning, and I imagine this may be a place where we have some specific questions, so we can always loop back to this. It's conference season, right? My kids' school had conferences today. Conferences are coming up in the next couple of weeks. Conferences are a great chance, especially if your child does not have an IEP or a 504 or a regular kind of time to check in, to gather some more information on executive functioning, what's working well and what isn't. You can ask about general executive functioning, but you might get a little bit further if you're asking about specific behaviors. Like, can you tell me the process for how you guys review homework at the end of the day? Or what should she be bringing home in that green folder that is like empty every day when it says it should have stuff in it? Getting some specifics. There may be different considerations for a child with an IEP or a 504, and there may be kind of heightened accommodations or things that can be provided on a regular, more consistent basis. But even for children who do not have a specific plan or a diagnosis, if you know this is something that your child is struggling with, there can be specific ways that you can touch base with your teacher, your child's teacher. You might say, could we try like signing the planner back and forth just for 2 weeks to see if that gets us any traction with him actually writing down what he needs to do? Or could we try just like a quick email home at the end of the week, just like a kind of quick check-in to see, tell me how it went this week with this specific thing that we're putting some energy behind. Okay, I'm gonna just leave this here for a moment, and we're not gonna spend so much time on it right now because we'll go back to this, but these are just some ways that we can start to think about at different developmental stages how we can employ executive functioning skills. So what I'll say about this is these are things like chores, daily tasks, things that happen over the course of a day. We're not going out and creating situations to practice executive functions, but they do happen best in real life. So executive functioning skills in isolation, it's one way to learn about them, but to test them out, to really kind of like kick the tires a little bit, we have to put them to work. We have to give kids chances to use them, and we have to expect that they're going to make mistakes. Okay, this is the hard part as a parent, right? All sounds fine and dandy to say like, yeah, we're going to cook dinner together, or you're going to be in charge of dinner, because seeing what you need and following a recipe and being flexible and managing the impulse to like eat half of it before dinner time. Great executive functioning practice. It is a very different thing when you are seeing them like dump half the salt container into the pot of taco meat, right? So we have to be willing to create some spaces where mistakes are going to happen and we have a little bit of bandwidth to recover from them. So what I'm saying is don't let your kid fix dinner if you actually have half an hour to get everybody fed and you're already working on like your last little bit of executive functioning yourself. Maybe save that for a Sunday afternoon when you know you have some frozen pizzas like in the freezer as a rescue item. Well, we can talk more about what this looks like in day-to-day life, but the big takeaways there, we have to provide opportunities, we have to expect mistakes. Okay. I want to end with this, and then we'll talk about some questions and other things that are on your mind. As we're talking about all of this, you may be thinking, I think my child is really struggling with this. Maybe your child already has a diagnosis where you know this is part of the diagnostic category of it, or maybe your child doesn't have a diagnosis, but you're thinking, this is sounding like this is more often than not. We're hitting a lot of struggle here. Executive functioning is very associated with ADHD. But not everybody with ADHD struggles with all of these areas, and lots of people who struggle with executive functions do not have ADHD. So they are separate but kind of overlapping domains. They also show up with things like anxiety disorders, depression, medical challenges, learning differences, and even just things like big transitions. Some, as Anna mentioned before, things like moving, new baby, divorce or separation, death and loss. All of these can bring up really significant executive functioning strategies. So good places to start if you're thinking you need more support. Connecting with kids is a great place to start if you really don't know where to go to kind of get that evaluation. Talking with your child's teacher, talking with your pediatrician, and really describing the behaviors, right? Describing what it feels like in these intense moments, how often it's happening, how much it seems to be getting in the way. Some other times where we really want to make sure that we are acting on these challenges is if we see that it is starting to create a lot of anxiety or to create big shifts in mood because of how much struggle is coming up, or if we are getting to a place where there is a lot of refusal to go to school because of how heavy this all feels. These are times where we want to intervene sooner rather than later because we don't want to establish pathways that are harder for kids to get out of. School avoidance in particular is really challenging. And so if we're seeing that there is a lot of complaining about going to school or a lot of stomach aches on Sunday nights and Monday mornings that are, keeping your kid home, and you have a hunch it might be related to some of these things, that's a good time to seek some additional support. Okay, I'm going to leave this here as we move on to some questions. The QR code is, I think, the same one that's on the handout. It'll take you to my website, and there's lots more information there.